Right, okay, this is lesson 79 and it's all about inflation. A lot of this session is all about printing money and whether or not it's a good idea to print money or not. And in a sense this is really my favourite subject, because what I always said before we even started printing money was there was one way in which we could pay for the Green Revolution, was the fact that if we printed money then we could pay to transform our economy from one that's largely based on oil to one that's largely based upon renewable technology. And I always thought that you could print the money, and surprisingly that would actually bring down cost push inflation, because once you had renewable resources that could not go up in price. If we use more of the sun, it is impossible for it to rise in price, whereas the price of oil was like to go up and up and up. In a sense I was slightly wrong, because I thought that the price of oil would now be maybe $200 a barrel. In fact, it's just over $100 a barrel as I taught. But there will come a stage when I do believe that resources will increase dramatically in value. But once again, I've been proved wrong, a little bit wrong again, because we got shale gas, and shale gas has come on board. So this is always the thing about economics. You make decisions and then your decisions may become out of date. However, the idea about printing money and creating a green revolution was actually pretty cool at that moment in time. However, let's just talk about the basics of inflation. Some of this has already been done, and then I'll talk to you about printing money, the advantages and disadvantages of printing money, and whether or not it's been worthwhile or not. Okay, so the causes of inflation. You certainly understand demand pull by now. We did this for almost from the first lesson. Demand pull, too much demand chasing too few goods, cost push, a rise in input prices, a low exchange rate will cause import prices to rise, and that will lead to a rise in input prices. So a low exchange rate can cause cost push. The monetarist argument that MV equals PT, that if the money supply goes up by 10%, then prices will also go up by 10% because V and T are stable. Also, something we haven't spoken about yet is the expectations of inflation. So say if we start printing money, then people may expect inflation to go up. Or if there's been inflation for a long period of time, then people would expect inflation to be higher in the future. Or conversely, because we've had low inflation now for a pretty long period of time, okay, apart from 2011, then therefore people expect lower inflation. But if you get an essay on what are the causes of inflation in the exam, it's a 15 out of 15, that's it. You just put that down, you're going to score 15 out of 15 quite easily, particularly if you draw some diagrams with them. Okay, just a very, very quick one here. The consequences of inflation for individuals and the economy. Well, the consequences of inflation for individuals, if you borrow loads of money, then inflation can be good, because in real terms that money will have decreased in value that you borrowed. So if you borrow a lot of money, inflation can be good. And the same actually goes for the government. If you borrow some money and we have 5% inflation, then in real terms the value of that debt goes down. However, inflation is actually pretty bad for most people, because in 2011 inflation went up by 5%, wages were only rising at 2%. Therefore, in real terms, people were seeing a fall in their incomes. And if that is the case, then they're going to be spending less money. And also, if we have inflation, it's likely that interest rates will go up. If you're in a house, if interest rates go up, therefore you're going to be paying more on your mortgage. Therefore, there's going to create less demand in the economy, therefore less jobs. Therefore, you could lose your job, and that is an individual consequence of higher inflation. You do not want inflation within an economy. On a macro level, on the economy level, we will sell fewer exports. If our inflation rate is higher than Germany's, then our goods will become less competitive, so therefore it will be harder to sell our goods. And actually what inflation does is it creates less confidence and stability within the economy. We've already covered this. How do we bring down inflation? Remember, we did a couple of essays on this. Well, we can put up interest rates. That's pretty good for demand pull inflation. The one that people tend to get wrong is cost push inflation. If the interest rate goes up, the exchange rate goes up. That means that import prices will go down. If import prices go down, that will lead to lower cost push inflation. However, clearly the best way of getting rid of inflation is through supply-side economics, but supply-side economics can take a long time to work its way through the economy. We've also already looked at the quantity theory of money. This is a monetarist argument. We've just looked at on the previous lesson about the natural rate of unemployment and how we want to reduce the long-run flips curve, we want to shift that inwards. They also, I think their big contribution is they are big believers in supply-side economics. Supply-side economics will solve all of your problems. And then the other part of that is they also believe in MV equals PT, and if we can control the money supply, we can therefore control prices. Now, then we move on to the period 2008. It's a big recession, and in 2009 the government decided that they would print money. At its most basic level, someone came up with the idea, well, we can use a thing called helicopter money, which is when a helicopter just gets up in the air, throws loads of money out all over the UK, people pick up the pound notes, spend them, and that creates aggregate demand. That is a good idea if you have a negative output gap. However, if the government ever did that, it would increase aggregate demand. Everybody would think they were pretty crazy. They wouldn't really get it. There'd be riots all over the place as people try to get hold of that dosh, and everybody would think, what on earth are they doing? This is completely crazy. Is the government out of control? And they lose confidence in it. However, what the government has actually gone and done is it has actually printed money, £225 billion worth, and gone out and brought government debt with that money. So they printed money and they brought back their own debt, which is extraordinary. And they got away with it to a large degree. People don't really understand that consequence of it. Okay, but that's what we're now going to be looking at. So overall, we can say that quantitative easing did in fact add to growth, and we're going to look at the good things about quantitative easing and the bad things about quantitative easing. Clearly, in your conclusion, you're going to say it's a risk, because if you print money, that money becomes worth less and people lose confidence in the system. But it appears that the government has sort of got away with it, and it has worked within the economy, as I always thought it would do. When I first mentioned the fact of printing money to create a green revolution, people were saying that guy over there should be locked up. How crazy is he? It would absolutely never work. And now we look with hindsight, they gave 360 billion quid over to the banking system, and it was the banking system that had got us into this mess in the first place by lending out too much money. So I didn't see any conflict there as long as you just didn't print loads and loads of money. I still think that option's available. And in fact, I think it's on the front page of the Green Party manifesto about printing money, so we put solar panels on houses, that's very labour intensive, and that will create jobs and reduce people's energy bills. That's their logic. Okay, but there are obviously risks with quantitative easing. The first one is we're giving it to the banks, and the banking system, or some bankers who got us in trouble in the first place, they all got too excited, they all acted in a herd, they all got together, they all got very, very macho about it, and they all lent loads and loads of money because they want to become the biggest, best bankers in the world. They want to make loads and loads of money because that makes them happy, and that was tied up to their status. And you know, RBS has to be bailed out to the tune of 75 billion quid at the end of the day. So why are we giving money to people who've already let us down? So there's a question there of morality and moral hazard, that we're giving money to people who've already committed errors. So we may get this risky lending all over again. Who's not to say? Because what bankers will do is if the government gives them money at very low rates of interest, then they're going to invest that money where they can get the highest rate of return. Now that may not be in terms of British business. It may be buying up commodities all over the world, and that will increase the price of commodities, that will actually increase cost push inflation. And in a sense what you'll be doing is you'll be exporting your inflation to the rest of the world. Okay, if those commodity prices do go up in value, then the banks will make more money, which will make them safer for the UK economy, and that will save us. But in a sense you're exporting your inflation to everybody else. The third point here about buying commodities creating cost push inflation. It will also lead to a fall in the exchange rate, because speculators will look at it and say, okay, what's happening here is that they're printing money, so therefore money is worth less, therefore let's sell sterling, and that will lead to a fall in the exchange rate. However, that's also an advantage for the UK economy, because we want to have a low exchange rate, because as you all know, what we want to try and do is we want to try and rebalance the UK economy. The fifth one on there is you can monetise the national debt, which is what I've just been talking about. The problem with that is, though, it makes it easy for governments not to address reform of the economy. Now, to me, if you do print money, at the same time, you have to reform what's happening. And clearly the government has been spending too much money on things. And the public sector is not as efficient as the private sector, and some things could be provided by the private sector. As I'm talking here, I sound a bit like some Friedmanite or a great believer in the free market system. I think you need to treat the free market system with a lot of care. I was constantly campaigning against the banks before the credit crunch in 2008, and I was seen as being completely off target. Right, they need to be regulated. However, the public sector has also got too big, which has put too much of a burden in terms of the UK economy. So it's okay paying off, monetising some of the national debt, which is printing money and buying back the government debt, but the government has still got to make the tough decisions in terms of reforming parts of the public sector. It may also be harder to sell bonds in the future, because once you start printing money to pay off debt, then people realise that your money is worth less. This is why the Chinese have become very angry with the Americans, because they've been paying off their debt through printed money. Their money is worth less, so therefore their exchange rate falls. So therefore they've invested all that money in American bonds, but actually that money is now those dollars are now worth less. So in a sense they've cheated the Chinese out of a lot of money. So therefore people are less likely to buy your bonds in the future, which therefore means you've got to pay a higher rate of interest to be able to sell those bonds. So there's some pretty massive risks of quantitative easing. You know, it's a really weird one, isn't it? Because you're printing money, and I would say, I always made the argument before 2007 that you could print money and you could get a free lunch for it, and everyone howled with laughter, and I was derided, etc. from all quarters. However, right, I never realised the government would go out and print 360 billion pounds worth and give it to the banking sector. I thought that was completely, I just never would have predicted that. Okay, so that's that. But there are benefits of quantitative easing. Firstly is that the exchange rate will fall, and that we want to rebalance our economy, and that's pretty good. The banks will have more cash, and if they have more cash, hopefully they will lend out to firms, so that therefore there will be more investment. You do not need to make the fiscal austerity as tough. Okay, now I think this is really important, because I think the government has been quite tough in terms of reforming parts of the public sector, and I think that's probably pretty good. But they don't need to make it really tough, which is what they've had to do in Greece, which is completely smash it. So it hasn't been as tough, but it's given us a bit of breathing space. But the government needs to carry on with that reform. And obviously savers will lose out. They'll lose out in two ways. They'll lose out because you print money, that will probably lower interest rates. So therefore banks will give them a lower rate of return on their money. But also obviously if you print money, their money becomes worth less, and they're going to lose money. Overall, I think it was worth the risk, and it still is a risk, and it still may lead to inflation in the future. My big contribution here is I would have set up a government bank which would have lent the money directly to businesses, because it's businesses and entrepreneurs which will get the country moving again. And I'm not sure how helpful the banking system has always been in terms of the UK economy. I would like to see an independent study on the whole banking system, because people say, well, we do a great job because we take people's savings, we're doing God's work. We take people's savings and we put it to firms. Well, of course they do. But any bank would always do that. But we're looking at these banks to test whether or not our banks have done a great job in terms of the UK economy. But one good thing that's happened because of all this banking crisis is before, whenever you spoke before the year 2007, and I can remember running a campaign in London against the banking system, and everyone would say, how dare you criticise people who are making loads and loads of money for the UK? What? You mean RBS lost 75 billion quid? Right, so no longer do we need to hold them as the masters of the universe. People are aware of some of their failings, and they've actually cost us enormous amounts of money. I think often at times the people who we should really respect are the engineers, the entrepreneurs, people who innovate and people who actually create things which are new. They are deserving of not of our gratitude, but they should be treated with a certain degree of respect. As in exactly the same way, should a good banker should be treated with respect, because they are in fact aiding the economy and they are creating strength. However, clearly something has gone wrong in this sector. Anyway, right, let's get back to the idea of printing money again. As regards aid to economics, I think it was a risk worth taking, but in the long term we may well suffer the consequences of inflation, but not quite as bad as people had probably feared. Okay, there you go. Inflation. Causes of inflation, pretty straightforward. Inflation has consequences for individuals and the economy. How do we bring down inflation? Quantitative theory of money, printing money, and risks of quantitative easing. But actually, for me, the biggest fear for inflation, which I keep on going on about, is resource price inflation, because there's going to be a lack of resources. Which is why I was so keen, which is why I said, well, if you print money and you spend it on a green revolution, that will actually, conversely, bring down inflation, which was greeted with a lot of laughter when I first spoke about those sorts of things, but now it seems like a really good idea. He says not being big-headed at all. Right, end of argument, inflation. Inflation is rising prices by definition, and deflation is falling prices. Now we can have good deflation, that is when there's massive rise in productivity, therefore goods become cheaper, and if goods become cheaper, e.g. like mobile phones, that is because of a rise in productivity, probably in this case due to innovation, so therefore people can make phone calls more cheaply, and that is the benefit to society. So it is possible to get falling prices, that's caused by productivity, and that's probably good deflation. But primarily deflation is a bad thing, and it really scares governments, and that's one reason why we've been printing money, because the UK government was always worried about getting deflation. Now falling prices seems like a very good idea, but your starting point here has to be that falling prices has probably been caused by a lack of demand, or falling prices has probably been caused by a very large negative output gap, and maybe the supply side of the economy's gone out, therefore firms are desperate to sell their goods, so therefore they are falling prices. So it sounds good, but it's not good. And it's not good for the following reasons, is that consumers may stop buying goods. And you say, well, why do you stop buying goods if prices are falling? Well, they may stop buying goods because prices are falling, but they may think that prices may fall by even more in the future. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it increases the real value of debt. So most people in the UK, they go out and buy houses, they may borrow £200,000, but if you have deflation, then in real terms, the value of that money rises. So in a sense, you've got to pay back even more money. And also the same with the government debt. It's pretty terrifying for them. They owe 1.3 trillion quid, which is an enormous amount of money, which is about 80% of GDP. And in a sense, in the long term, they'll have to pay back even more. Which means that's why, in a way, when we did have inflation of 5% in 2011, in a way, it's quite a good way of getting rid of government debt. Also, deflation tends to be associated with negative growth, e.g. Greece, and negative growth, therefore the tax returns fall for the government, so therefore that will exacerbate and increase national debt, so that the Greeks were trying to cut G. By cutting G, that led to a fall in AD, tax returns fell, so national debt got even bigger. Right, one classic way, which is why we are so addicted to growth in the UK, from an individual level and on a government level, is because the government has loads and loads of debt. But if you get growth every single year, so that's rising up all the time, and at the same time national debt stays exactly the same level, then your national debt as a percentage of GDP will fall. So just say on here, actually, if I just make this a little bit higher, so in this case, at that point here, national debt will be 100% of GDP. But then GDP goes up by 20%, national debt stays at the same level because they've had budget deficits of 0 for 5 years, then your national debt as a percentage of GDP will fall, even though your national debt is at the same level. So therefore it creates more confidence in the economy. Conversely, what happens if GDP falls in nominal terms, so GDP is getting less and less and less, right, but national debt stays at the same level, then even though national debt is at the same level, obviously as a percentage of GDP it will be rising, and this is a very dangerous situation and something that absolutely terrifies Europe. There may be lots of real wage unemployment because people don't like to accept wage cuts in nominal terms, so therefore people continue to pay themselves the same amount of money, so therefore firms will employ fewer people because they're more expensive to employ in real terms. And lastly, monetary policy will become ineffective because if you've got deflation, even if you're offering a 0% rate of interest and you keep your money in the bank, in real terms the value of that money is rising. So therefore you cannot stimulate the economy anymore through interest rates. Hence this idea of getting a helicopter, printing loads of money and giving to people so at least they spend money. Okay, so you never want to have deflation. Which is worse, inflation or deflation? Well, that's a classic A-level question. I would say, well, high inflation is really, really bad. Hyperinflation destroys confidence. People lose confidence in the system, therefore there's a lack of investment. In exactly the same way with deflation is exactly the same, is that people will lose confidence in the system, that will cause a lack of investment and your economy is going to go downhill. You don't want deflation, you certainly do not want hyperinflation, you don't even want a high inflation, you want inflation to be about 2%. Okay. From an individual viewpoint, so from a macro viewpoint, from an economy viewpoint, deflation is bad for all of those reasons. The national debt's going to get worse, lower tax returns, lower demand, real wage unemployment. Okay? For the individual, well, savers will gain. If you've got £1 million in the bank, then in real terms that money's going to increase in value, so it's good. But borrowers are going to lose out, and particularly in the UK, where so many individuals are in debt, so many firms are in debt, the government is also in debt, the last thing you want is deflation. And you know, you've got to give a lot of credit to the government for stopping deflation from occurring. Perhaps they were lucky, I don't know, but anyway. And lastly, of course, because it's caused by a lack of demand, you may lose your job. So at an individual level, deflation is really, really bad. I just want to say something about Japan, because Japan is always the best example of deflation. In fact, the way the Japanese have handled their economy is really, really interesting, but I'll leave that for at a later date. Now, a lot of people say that the reason why Japan had a decade of very low economic growth was because of deflation. Yeah, and partially they are true. But actually, a bigger reason than that is because the banking system lent out loads and loads of money and it created loads of zombie firms. The government didn't want to pull the plug on the banks because that would have created a massive fall in demand and everything else. But during that time, the banks were determined to keep these firms going, even though these firms weren't doing very well. So it's a classic case. They borrowed so much money, they didn't want these firms to go bust, because if they went bust, say you've got a firm that's worth £1 billion and that firm goes bust, then immediately the bank's going to lose £1 billion and it goes on their books. But by keeping them afloat and pretending the firm is sort of doing okay, then those debts aren't realised. So the problem probably with Japan was they were keeping a lot of what they call zombie firms going, and they weren't creating new firms which take their place, which are naturally innovative. So that's the whole idea of the free market, is that you create innovative firms that are better than the previous firms. So if you took the example of Apple and British Telecom that used to be owned by the government, well, clearly Apple was brilliant, has been absolutely amazing for the whole world in terms of creating the mobile phone and the Apple iPhone in terms of what it does. However, British Telecom, when it was nationalised by the government, was not a particularly effective firm. In fact, I can remember buying a mobile phone from British Telecom, and it was about the size of this flipping chair, and it made a huge noise when it went off. It was like an air raid siren going off. So, innovation's cool. So actually, I don't think Japan, yes, it did have a lost decade due to deflation, but it was actually because their banking system had given out so many bad loans and the government probably was not tough enough with their banking system. So, that's the argument for deflation. Which is worse, inflation or deflation? Depends to the extent of how high inflation is or how bad deflation is. You don't want either for the economy, unless of course it is good deflation.